On this episode of the Catholic Echo podcast from the Diocese of Youngstown, brought to you by the annual Diocesan Appeal and Cumulus Radio Youngstown, we're talking about Catholic artists in the diocese with Bishop David Bonnar, Father James Daprile, and Joan Bratt. Find more about this episode's topic, including articles from the Catholic Echo, at www.catholicecho.org/podcast. And now the host of the Catholic Echo podcast, Dennis Viviana.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Echo podcast. Today we will discuss the topic of Catholic artists in the Diocese of Youngstown. Bishop Bonnar joins us today. Nice to see you as always.
Always great to be here, Dennis.
Now, to get started, do you have a favorite Catholic artist, and what is the piece of art that inspires you?
So I was so blessed to study in Rome. All my theological studies took place at the Pontifical Gregorian University, and I lived at the North American College. And so St. Peter's Basilica was right literally in my backyard. I would just walk down the hill. I could be there in about 8 to 10 minutes. And there were many a day when after class and then pranzo, which is big dinner that you have at lunchtime, I would go down to the square of St. Peter's and I would go inside the basilica. It was so much easier then because this was pre-9/11. And I would often go in there to just pray. And I would, inevitably, my sights would go to the Pietà, the beautiful sculpture of Mary cradling Jesus, and just behold that, because that piece of art says so much about our faith and our life. I mean, it speaks about sacrifice, it speaks about motherhood, it speaks about respect for the dead. It's like a gift that just continues to be unwrapped, and how humbling it would always be to see people come from near and far to behold this image. And then it doesn't end there, because there's also the Sistine Chapel. Of course, Michelangelo was instrumental in both of these. And the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, they just grab you. And, I used to think that this Sistine Chapel was this huge edifice, but it's really rather small. It's not all that large, but it's stunning. So I would say Michelangelo is one of my favorite artists. And just having lived and studied in Rome, it was just such a blessing.
Now, some Catholics use artwork in their private devotions. I guess, how can someone get started using Catholic art for prayer at home?
It's very simple. It's as simple as finding a prayer card with an image and keeping it near your bedside or wherever you pray. Or it's placing that statue nearby. When I was in Rome the last time, I love the image of the Holy Spirit at St. Peter's Basilica. And I found an imitation of that in one of the stores, and it sits in my bedroom. And I periodically look at that and am reminded that I'm not in charge. The Holy Spirit is in charge. And that Spirit spans time. So I think those are just some ways. Icons. I have a collection of icons that periodically I look at and behold. It can be very, very simple.
Now let's talk a little bit about Catholic artists themselves. I guess, what advice or encouragement do you have for Catholics who are interested in created sacred artwork?
Don't ever be discouraged. Continue to embrace your gifts and share them with the world. I know that when I became the editor of the Priest magazine over 10 years ago, I was entrusted with the whole idea of redesigning the magazine. And in the redesigning of it, what I was drawn to was this whole idea of art. And I thought, and I shared this with our team at the time, that we need to be intentional about bringing out the beauty of our artistic tradition in our faith. And so every month we have an art piece, whether it's an image, a fresco, a mural, a sculpture, a painting, and we have someone who writes about it. And that's always a hard task, trying to put words to an image, because those images take us beyond words inevitably. And I think even when we go to Mass, we become creatures of habit. There's just something, we come in, we occupy our seat in the pew, we go through our routine, our ritual. I would invite people to kind of step out of that and maybe sit in a different place and look at a different part of the church, because there's so much beauty to behold in any church.
You and Monsignor Sifrin team up to renovate the St. Columba Cathedral, especially cleaning and beautifying the mural. Why is it important, I guess, to invest in installing and maintaining artwork in our sacred spaces?
We're talking about God's house, and God takes us to mystery, to beauty, to glory, and to wonder. And there's a sense in which words fail to capture that. So it's important to highlight those images, those statues that invite us deeper into reflection and worship. And it's always important, from time to time to step back and see if there needs to be some renewal, some freshness, if you will. Mm-hmm. Maybe, painting the walls of the church, or restoring a statue, or cleaning the stained glass windows. Those are all important exercises to maintain the beauty, the dignity of God's house.
Now, Bishop Bonnar, you've also presided at installations of sacred artwork from closed parishes, and listeners can find out more on CatholicEcho.org about that. But could you tell us a little bit more about the installation ritual itself?
It's customary whenever a new statue or some type of restoration takes place to call upon God's special grace and to commemorate that moment. Sometimes the item comes from a closed church building, or sometimes it's simply a restored image. I was just up in Cleveland at the seminary where the chapel was restored. Mm-hmm. And I was the guest of Bishop Malasik for the Mass, and I celebrated with our 8 men who were there in formation, along with all the other seminarians and the faculty and some other people. And they were out of that house for probably 2 years. And so it was such a glorious celebration, and every act was very intentional, just pregnant with meaning. And it's something that has to be celebrated. So the Book of Blessings has a blessing for sacred images that can be modified, and typically that's what is used, some form of that.
And last question I want to ask you today is, you established our diocesan archives and curator of the patrimony to help document and share sacred artwork from closed church buildings so they can continue to inspire prayer. Now, what is it like to be part of that process, and what is it like for you to preside at those installation ceremonies, and how do people react to them?
Our faith is about ritual, it's about celebration, and so much of our faith is about imagery. So one of the more moving moments for me happens when we close a church and we point out for the last time the pulpit, the baptistry, the altar. These are things that we can so easily take for granted. So what I find, it's eye-opening and it's renewing for our people anytime we shine the spotlight on art. And just to give an example, our cathedral, that beautiful mural that's there, it is just amazing. It was covered for so many years, and it really just tells a story.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop Bonnar. When we return, I'll have a conversation with retired Diocese of Youngstown priest and artist, Father James Daprile. Much more to come on the Catholic Echo podcast.
When storms hit, we are there to rebuild. As our neighbors age, we lighten their burdens. As our veterans adjust, we ease their transitions. In every part of the country, we are there. We are Catholic Charities. We serve millions each year regardless of their faith. We put food back on tables, unlock doors, and walk together on the road back. Help Catholic Charities serve your neighbors in need. Join us at wearethere.us.
Hello, I'm Dennis Viviano, joining you from the Diocese of Youngstown studios. We have a special guest today, Father Jim Daprile, longtime priest in our diocese, an artist, a professor, to talk about Catholic art here in our diocese. Thanks for joining us. Great to meet you.
Happy to be with you, Dennis.
I appreciate it. Tell everybody here a little bit about the places that have been along your journey, where you grew up, and how you first got interested in art.
I'm the oldest of 13 kids, born in Youngstown on the Epiphany. Just always had a fascination with color and design and movement. I remember one of my earliest experiences, my aunt taking me to Powers Auditorium and seeing the Nutcracker. In the seminary, I had a chance for opportunities for symphony and theater and art museums. I began to teach, and I've always used art as a supportive material for other kinds of learners other than just rational, verbal kind of communication. I had the opportunity in 2009 to take a sabbatical, and I spent a month, 6 weeks in Santa Fe working on my art, developing a style. And since then, I've tried to use that for presentations, and right now in retirement, I'm a docent at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I'm surrounded by it and almost full time.
One of the leading art museums in the country. What's that experience like?
It's just amazing to be in a place where there's just so much beauty, so much that beckons and asks questions. That's stimulating. I find it fascinating. And also the people that come with their questions, with their interest, and their various angles on what I think might be normative and how they might understand it.
I'm sure you're asked this a million times being a priest, but what is the role of art in the Catholic Church to you?
Well, I think because we're a church that's sacramental, that's earthy, that's human, incarnational, we try to use all the elements that appeal to our senses, our humanity. So art from the very beginning, the art of Jesus' physical presence, to the church using elements of bread and wine to continue to represent his enduring presence among us, to being able to illustrate that, to capture it, to be able to share it, to catechize with it, to delve deeper into the mysteries that we celebrate.
And of course, the intent is to bring us closer to God.
Right. And I think some of the recent popes in their messages, their talks with the artists, for the last 25 years since John the 23rd, have always had artists around them. And Paul VI started the Vatican galleries and modern galleries, understanding that beauty can draw us deeper into mystery, into the beyond, into the transcendent. Pope Francis recently, on the 50th anniversary of the Vatican Museum, said art should be like a thorn in the heart. And he meant that it's kind of a probing thing, questioning us, studying us a little bit, probing us to look deeper, to explore, to step into new realms, to enter into a relationship that is not tangible but significant, holy, mysterious.
Now, Catholic art has taken on a number of forms over the centuries. How would you say it has evolved?
It's evolved from the crude. The first piece of Christian art that we know is called Blasphemo Graffito. It was a piece where Jesus was portrayed on the cross as a donkey, and it said this worshiper is worshiping a donkey, basically, to people trying to represent significant elements. Earlier catacombs, sketches of Mary holding the child, of bread baskets representing Eucharist, to the journey, to each age trying to particularize what was important to them, capturing the biblical narrative, the dogmatic statements of the era, to try to inflesh that reality for their own time. So, every era has a characteristic to it, whether from the very primitive, crude, to very refined period. Some people stop at the Middle Ages with that. I think the refined period continues right in our own time as well.
Now, you recently spoke to the Canton Repository about the crucifix. Of course, we all have them. I guess what is the deeper meaning in that symbol?
Well, I think the meaning is consistent. It's kenosis, it's an emptying, it's a sacrifice, it's an act of love, it's obedience to the Father. And every generation tries to understand that in their own ways. And the cross takes on different forms and trying to represent different ideas within that. So whether Christ on the cross is ruling and in charge, whether Christ is a suffering victim, more so in the Middle Ages where you see a flagellated body, crown of thorns, bloodied, to an era where there is a transcendent character to the crucifixion. So each era tries to design and uses the cross to try to design its own relationship to Jesus, its suffering, what the Paschal mystery is. What does it mean to die to Christ, to die to self, to be raised up in obedience to God's love?
With all we've said, the Bible also says not to worship statues, art, and don't make idols. That's important.
Yeah, that was one of the early controversies in the church because of those sanctions against idolatry. And so the church was a little reticent to figure what Christ was like. And, we don't have cameras or cell phones to capture anything then. So people had to begin to hold that memory dear in some fashion. And the great iconoclastic controversies in the 6th and 7th centuries was settled in a way saying that as Christ became incarnate, became flesh, humanity, human means is a way to represent God's mystery. Inadequately, for sure, but in an attempt to open us up to the beyond, to what God has to offer us, what God has to suggest for our life and for our futures.
How do you think art and religion can be used to explore social justice?
That's very contemporary. Art, at least in the stuff that I've seen lately, represents maybe different kinds of people on the cross. Fritz Eichenberg, an artist, a wood carver that I relish very much, had a black crucifixion. He was done during the 60s, when the civil rights era was going on. And so to remind us that when we crucify our brothers and sisters, regardless of race or gender, we're crucifying Christ. There's an ecological Christ wearing a gas mask. There's the famous piece by Andres Serrano called Piss Christ, which has a crucifix submerged in urine. It's a challenge to Christians because have we really just taken the love of Christ, the crucifixion, the sacrifice for granted? Do we just kind of honor this by our mouths and then just do what we want to do? And so people got upset saying that's blasphemy, but it's really a challenge that the art would ask believers to say, does this really hold true in your life? Is this something significant, or is it just waste material?
Fascinating conversation. Father Jim Daprile, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming in.
Happy to be here, Dennis. Thank you.
When we return, Colin Vogt speaks to another Catholic artist in our diocese, Joan Bratt, on some of her newest ventures. That conversation coming up. Keep it right here on the Catholic Echo podcast. The Catholic Echo is the media arm of the Catholic Diocese of Youngstown, and it seeks to inform and entertain Catholics in our 6-county diocese by forging stronger connections to our parish communities and highlighting the many blessings of Catholic life in our region. If you have a story idea for the Catholic Echo magazine, podcast, or website, send an email to catholicecho@youngstowndiocese.org. We'd love to hear your ideas.
Hello and welcome back to the Catholic Echo podcast. My name is Colin Vogt, and today I am joined by a local artist from Austinburg, Joan Bratt. Joan, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Joan, can you tell us just a little bit about your art and what kind of got you interested in being an artist?
Let's see, I've always been drawing since I was a little kid. My mom had really great taste in children's books, so I always illustration. My first introduction was kids' books.
What were the books? We got to hear.
One of my favorites called Hecate Peg. It's by Don and Audrey Wood, and it's like it has like a German quality. It's like a fairy tale with really great pictures, like paintings, so it has a lot of
Nice.
atmosphere. Yeah, that was one of my favorites.
Gotcha.
But kind of a broad spectrum of pictures.
So she had all these great children's books and everything, so that was an early influence?
I'd say that was the earliest. I didn't actually go to an art museum until I was quite a bit older, but then, that was a whole new, just amazing experience. So I trained in a atelier, it's called, so it's classical realist paintings, and my goal was to become an illustrator, but it's kind of shifted since then, like working with Megan, how she does the Montessori, the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, so I've been doing illustrations for her. It's mostly botanical borders, so it's a lot different from the way that I was trained, because my training was in like oil paint and pencil. I really love the detail that you can get with pen and ink, so that's really cool.
How would you describe yourself as an artist today? What's the difference?
I guess I'm kind of a jack of all trades right now. I'd say the two things that I do most are still life, oil painting. In school, we had to do still life. That was like one of the assignments, and I just kind of fell in love with it. I don't know what it is, just kind of taking the time to examine a very simple object, like a piece of fruit or a dish, these kind of homely items, and then you just observe the way light falls on them and kind of try and bring that to... You're not really beautifying it because it's already beautiful, but I guess just trying to capture it gives recognition to its beauty. I suppose that's what I'd love to focus on, but right now that's kind of secondary to the illustrations.
When did you kind of really decide to go for it and get into art as a career?
I guess it was 2016 that I started school. As soon as I decided to go to school for art, that was it had always been my vague idea, but as soon as I started doing the training, I just knew it was what I wanted to pursue. Since leaving school, it's just been I have a lot of different projects going on, my sister and I are establishing a little homestead. We have like goats and a couple acres, so there's a lot of different things we're into, but it's always kind of the dream is always to have art be the main focus, I guess.
Okay, so you talked about like a lot of different styles that you got exposure to through this atelier. So what would you say is like your style? What do you enjoy working with the most? Is there any kind of medium that you really think is like, that's my thing that I love?
I'd say it's a toss-up. I love the combination of pen and ink with watercolor, and I love oil paint. So I think those two, I always feel very relaxed when I'm doing pen and ink. It's a very meditative. I love to do like botanical studies, plants and kind of more whimsical work, and so I'd say it's kind of more meditative. And then oil is a little harder for me still. I haven't, I'd say, gotten quite as comfortable as I want, but I absolutely love the effect of it. So it's a two-way split between those two.
You mentioned the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So what is that exactly? What is that something going on in the Diocese of Youngstown?
Megan, her company is called Mustard Seed Training, and I think she ships all over the world, but she works with local vendors. and produces products that are up to Montessori standard for the catechesis, because they have pretty strict regulations of what they use in there. They're called the atriums that they use to do like children's catechesis in churches. There's also at-home programs, but it all kind of is up to this particular standard. So she works with like carpenters that do the little figures for, there's like little Arks of the Covenant and little synagogues. And so she works with local carpenters. She works with, I know there's like a seamstress that does vestments and that kind of thing. And then what I've mostly been doing for her is illustrated borders that match with different, like we did a whole series of the Rosary, the Decades of the Rosary, and then a whole series of Messianic prophecies. We did the Works of Mercy. So just themed to different liturgical seasons and subjects. So it's been really cool.
So for those who don't know, Megan is part of our communications team at the Diocese of Youngstown. She is not only great here for the diocese, but she's also helping to spread the word of God in many other ways. So that's fantastic. So let's get into that a little bit. Speaking of God, has your faith always been part of your artistic vision? Is that something that came later, or was that the initial point?
I think understanding the relation between beauty and goodness came later, at least in a way that I would articulate it. I always liked representational art over abstract and kind of just valued beauty in a way. But I think it during school is when I really started thinking about what art is to me. And I think, and then lately, now that I've been doing these illustrations for a while and just kind of really digging into my own ideas of art, I think it's the reason I love it so much, I guess, is because I love the idea of bringing something that's accessible to anyone. Something like a still life isn't overtly religious, but it does, I guess, reaffirm the goodness of creation. And people really seem to love still lifes. It doesn't matter who they are. Like whenever I have like an art show, they're always what sells is the still lifes.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to me because they're simple, but it's just the beauty of piece of creation. And it's amazing to me that can relate to religion, but it does.
And I think that really points to just how many cultural artifacts and just how many things that we take for granted around us are rooted in Catholicism and
Yes.
Christian ideals. Just even the concept of college and university is from Catholic studies. It is from the clerics and the people that were learning and advancing science and biology and stuff to study God's creation. Those things have religious roots, and it just goes to show just how much the symbology that's around us is really influenced by those cultural values as well. So it's not just something that influences us when we go to church. Those things are all around us.
Yes, it's affected the entire world. The musical tradition.
Oh yeah, that's a great example too. Does your faith influence your art, or does your art influence your faith?
I think both. I think the faith is it's like a treasure house of, just the most beautiful imagery. And once you believe in God, you just feel creation is so beautiful that if you have even the remotest inclination to art, you just have no end of things to love and look at, and the seasons are so inspiring. So there's just that. And then when you're reading the stories of the Bible, the Old Testament stories, there's like beautiful stories of friendship. Like I love the story of Jonathan and David. That's just something that I guess there's no end of inspiring stories, so they kind of feed your imagination. And then there's no end of beautiful imagery, like in the Psalms. We did a whole series of borders earlier this year based on the Psalms, and there was like one about the ships and storms at sea, and then there's the Lord is my shepherd, which is just beautiful imagery. So there's no end of inspiration from my faith. And then I guess when it comes to trying to, as far as my art deepening my faith, I guess it's such a privilege to be able to participate in creation.
And I'm a writer, right, for the Catholic Echo. It's kind of, I think, similar to what you're experiencing right now. You have this enjoyment of something, but for me, I was kind of like, do I want to be an author? And as I've kind of gotten older, I've realized like that kind of writing is just not uplifting to me. It's very like painful and difficult, and I actually just enjoy getting to interview people and speak with people and write stories. So I'm wondering if you kind of have an experience of that yourself with your art and your talent.
Yeah, that's very relatable. It's kind of, you stop thinking about like whether or not you're going to be the best-selling author of the next American novel, and instead it's just kind of, is it fulfilling? Is it, because it's really great. I live around a lot of family and in a very small town, and I think there was a period where I kind of was torn between should I stay in New York and kind of make these connections in the fine art world, but it just really did not appeal to me ultimately. And this is a much smaller path, but I can see directly how it touches someone's life when something I produce, goes to someone's home, or like these borders. Megan will always send me when somebody has something nice to say about the borders, and it's always like, their kids love it, or it's helped in some way with their religious education. And that's really, you can feel that you've done something beyond yourself, I guess.
Speaking of doing something big or doing something beyond yourself, so are there any big projects that you're working on right now that you'd like to let people know about?
I don't have any big projects right now. I have a bunch of small projects. So I've been, Austinburg this Christmas will be our third annual Christmas walk, which is we get all the local businesses to stay open late, and we do like carriage rides and apple cider and Christmas caroling. And then this will be the third year we've done an art show. So that's been really, really fun. So this will be the third annual. So I've been trying to get some little still lifes for that, because the whole point of it is kind of Christmas shopping. So
yeah,
I've been trying to do some smaller sized still lifes. And then with Megan Howe, I've been we started a subscription service. So you can sign up and once a month get a custom border based on we did the Psalms for the first half of the year, and then we moved to a different theme that is escaping my mind.
So
Prophecies.
These borders, is it for like stationery, or what is it for?
Yeah, so stationery and prayer cards. So you can use them. Some of them are coloring sheets. So there's a black and white version, and then there's a color version. So you can use them as like prayer guides, write the different scripture verses that pertain to them with inside it, or it can just be stationery. One person was ordering them with the letterheads of their church. It's a lot of fun to do. It's one of my favorite styles of art.
So one last question before we go. Are there any like other Catholic artists that you might recommend for our listeners to take a look at that inspire you, or that you feel like are producing art that is, sort of aligned with our values?
Specific artists, I'm kind of bad with names, but there's the Catholic Art Institute out of Chicago. They have competitions every year of religious art, and this year I think they had a still life competition too, and they do conferences. So it's great for aspiring artists, Catholic artists, to kind of get their names out, and they have a lot of exposure for artists. So that's really cool. That's really great. And then it's not specifically Christian, but it's called the ARC, which is Art Renewal Center. And they're the same thing. It's a great resource for artists. That is, all of the ateliers are kind of under the umbrella of the ARC, the Art Renewal Center. And it's the same thing. It's great opportunities for artists. They have a show every year, a competition, and great resources. And you can also, just find a lot of really inspiring artists through them.
Well, Joan, is there anywhere that people can go to keep up with your work and just see what you're working on?
My website it's called Seventh Sister Art. I'm fairly up to date on there. And then I do have an Instagram, but I'm a lot worse at keeping up on my Instagram. But that is,
That's Sister not a bad thing, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Joan. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was great.
So if you'd like to learn more, you can go to catholicecho.org and read about it there.
The Catholic Echo podcast is a production of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Youngstown. Your host has been Dennis Biviano. Have a blessed day, and may God be with you.